The Secretary-General will make a statement to brief on his priorities in 2021, after which the formal meeting will be suspended for an informal meeting for comments and questions. Secretary-General, the floor is yours.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 2020 was a global annus horribilis, a year of death, disaster, and despair. The COVID-19 pandemic unleashed havoc in every country and every economy. We lost 2 million lives, including many dear members of our UN family. And the human toll continues to multiply. The economic costs continue to mount, 500 million jobs gone, extreme poverty back up to levels not seen in a generation, inequalities widening, hunger rising again. And global fragilities continue to be exposed. We have declared war on nature, and nature is striking back. The climate crisis is raging. Last year, natural disasters caused $210 billion in damage and an incalculable human cost. Biodiversity is collapsing. Meanwhile, geopolitical tensions are undermining our collective efforts for peace. Humanitarian needs are escalating. Forced displacement reached record levels last year, and even the risk of nuclear and chemical proliferation grows. Human rights face a backlash, hate speech is booming, lawless behavior in cyberspace has created a new domain for the propagation of crime, violence, misinformation, and disruption. And COVID-19 has had an especially pernicious impact on the world's women and girls. Excellencies, 2020 brought us tragedy and peril. 2021 must be the year to change gear and put the world on track. We need to move from death to health, from disaster to reconstruction, from despair to hope, and from business as usual to transformation. The Sustainable Development Goals are more important now than ever. And now is the time to secure the well-being of people, economies, societies, and the planet. It is possible, so we must make it happen together. Excellencies, the first priority I want to underline for 2021 is to respond to COVID-19. Vaccines are the first great moral test before us. These must be seen as global public goods, people's vaccines, available and affordable to all. The COVAX facility urgently needs more resources to procure and deliver vaccines to low and middle-income countries, and to continue vital research and development. I thank the countries and organizations that are supporting COVAX and the leadership of the World Health Organization. And I welcome new engagement by major developed countries. But the world is falling short. Vaccines are reaching a handful of countries quickly, while the poorest countries have almost none. Science is succeeding, but solidarity is failing. Governments have a responsibility to protect their populations, but COVID-19 cannot be beaten one country at a time. If the virus is allowed to spread like wildfire in the global south, it will inevitably mutate. It is mutating, becoming more transmissible, more deadly, and eventually more resistant to vaccines, ready to come back to haunt the global north. Moreover, recent studies have found that vaccine hoarding could cost the global economy up to $9.2 trillion, with almost half of that impact in the wealthiest countries themselves. That figure is over 340 times more than the $27 billion funding gap for the ACT accelerator. There is only one victor in a world with a vaccine haves and vaccine have-nots, the virus itself. And today I'm calling for 6 specific steps. Prioritize healthcare workers and those most at risk everywhere. Protect health systems from collapse in the poorest countries. Ensure enough supply and fair distribution, including by having manufacturers prioritize supply to COVAX. Share excess doses with the COVAX facility. Make licenses widely available to scale up manufacturing. And boost vaccine confidence. Our verified initiative is fighting the infodemic, but there is no panacea in a pandemic. We must continue to take the scientifically proven steps that reduce transmission. Wearing masks, physical distancing, washing hands. To defeat COVID-19 is possible. We must make it happen together. Excellencies, second, the world cannot heal from the virus if economies are on life support. An inclusive and sustainable recovery must start now. We need massive investments in health systems everywhere, universal health coverage, mental health care, social protection, decent work, and children safely back in school. Developing countries have been drained of remittances, tourism revenues, and earnings from commodities. Wealthier countries are implementing recovery and stimulus plans worth trillions of US dollars. Yet the poorest countries have been able to spend only about 2% of their small gross domestic product. Recovery must be inclusive. No country should be forced to choose between providing basic services and servicing their debts. The high-level events I convened last year with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica highlighted the urgent need for a quantum leap in financial support. This includes an expansion of the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, debt relief for all developing and middle-income countries that need it, increased resources for multilateral financial institutions, and the new allocation of special drawing rights to the benefit of developing countries, a voluntary reallocation of unused special drawing rights, as liquidity is crucial to prevent debt defaults. Recovery must also be sustainable, embracing renewable energy and green and resilient infrastructure. Otherwise, we will lock in harmful practices for decades to come. The 2030 Agenda points the way. A sustainable and inclusive recovery is possible. We must make it happen together. Excellencies, a third priority must therefore be making peace with nature. 2021 is a critical year for climate and biodiversity. Last month, I called on member states to declare a climate emergency in their countries. Today, I call on the international community to reach 5 key milestones by COP26 in November. First, let's keep building the global coalition to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The coalition now represents 70% of the world economy and 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions. In the year ahead, let's ensure it covers at least 90% of emissions. G20 countries and main emitters must lead the way. And I call on every city, company, and financial institution to adopt concrete roadmaps with clear intermediary milestones to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. Key sectors such as shipping, aviation, industry, and agriculture must do the same. Second, governments must submit national determined contributions to cut global emissions by 45% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. Third, we need to achieve a breakthrough on adaptation. Adaptation cannot be the forgotten component of climate action. Donors and multilateral development banks should increase the share of adaptation finance from 20 to at least 50% by 2024. Fourth, meet all finance commitments. Developed countries must fulfill their pledge to mobilize $100 billion annually for climate action in developing countries, and it's not yet happening. And this should include full capitalization of the Green Climate Fund. And all development banks should align their portfolios with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals by 2024, and help mobilize private finance and investment through guarantees and partnerships. These will shift billions of financial flows. The UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance are two critical elements of these efforts. Fifth, adopt transformational policies. It's time to put a price on carbon, stop building new coal power plants, phase out coal in OECD countries by 2030 and everywhere else by 2040, phase out fossil fuel finance, starting with the overseas financing of coal, and subsidies to fossil fuels, shift the tax burden from income to carbon, from taxpayers to polluters, make climate-related financial disclosures mandatory, and integrate carbon neutrality in all economic and fiscal policies and decisions. And finally, promote, fund, and implement just transition plans. Excellencies, particular solidarity is owed to the world's small island developing states. Some face an existential threat. Their territories could disappear within our lifetimes. We must never allow any member state to be forced to fold its flag because of a problem that is within our power to fix. COP26 in November will be a moment of truth for climate action. And COP15 on biodiversity is a chance to halt the extinction crisis through a new post-2020 biodiversity framework. Let's not forget that 75% of new and emerging human infectious diseases are zoonotic. This year's high-level dialogue on energy will propose solutions for the shift to renewables and the expansion of energy access. As we prepare for the Ocean Conference in Portugal, the world must accelerate action to stop overfishing, drastically reduce pollution, including plastics, and promote the blue economy. The Food Systems Summit and Global Conference on Sustainable Transport can transform those vital sectors. 2021 will also be critical in advancing the new urban agenda, and we know our cities are important. To reconcile with nature is possible. We must make it happen together. Excellencies, a fourth priority is to tackle the pandemic of poverty and inequality. More than 70% of the world's people are living with rising wealth inequality. But wealth is not the only measure. People's chances in life depend on their gender, race, family, and ethnic background, whether they have a disability, and other factors. These injustices feed each other, cause people to lose trust in governments and institutions, and resound down the generations. The pandemic has made things worse. We see it in the way COVID-19 has preyed on the vulnerable and marginalized. This week's report by Oxfam found also that simply the increase in the wealth of the 10 richest men, and they are men, during the crisis would be enough to prevent anyone from falling into poverty because of the virus and to pay for COVID-19 vaccinations for all, everywhere. I continue to call for a new social contract within countries to ensure that all people have prospects and protection. Education and digital technology must be the two great enablers and equalizers. Reforms to labor markets and forceful efforts against corruption, tax havens, money laundering, and illicit financial flows will also be critical. Societies must transform the world of care. Official development assistance remains a lifeline. It's time to redress the wrongs of the past and address the systemic injustices of our time. To keep our promise to leave no one behind is possible. We must make it happen together. Mesdames et messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, attacks on human rights are becoming the norm. Our fifth priority must be to reverse this trend. Long before the pandemic, human rights were the target of serious, increasingly grave attacks. The rule of law was hanging by a thread as a result of the fragile nature of judicial systems. Repressive political systems were waging war on fundamental freedoms. Atrocity crimes were largely going unpunished. Women, girls, minorities, and LGBTI persons were facing discrimination and chronic violence. My call to action for human rights the Plan of Action on Hate Speech, and the Initiative to Safeguard Religious Sites all predate the outbreak of COVID-19. Today, the pandemic has triggered a new human rights crisis. Hate speech is spreading further and wider than ever before. A number of states have taken advantage of lockdown measures to monitor and reduce civic space, to curb the work of journalists and that of human rights advocates. The illness has a disproportionate impact on minorities, persons with disabilities, and men and women that live on society's margins. I hail the new fervour with which people are calling for racial justice today throughout the world. Racial inequality poisons our institutions, social structures, and our daily lives. We must join hands and rally to tackle the rising tide of neo-Nazism and white supremacy. The United Nations organization will never let up in the fight against racism and discrimination. There is no place for racism within our organization, and we will continue to do everything in our power to stamp it out. Promoting and protecting all human rights in their entirety is possible. We must make that a reality together. Ladies and gentlemen, our sixth priority is to achieve gender equality, and this is perhaps the greatest challenge that is facing human rights as a whole. COVID-19 has made clear what we too often ignore. Women are essential workers which allow others to subsist. However, they are more greatly affected by job losses, and greater numbers of them have been plunged into poverty as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic has at the same time triggered a new epidemic of violence against women. Domestic violence, cyber violence, an increase in child marriage, and an increase in sexual exploitation. At the same time, in the face of COVID-19, women have demonstrated astounding capacity to lead. Female leaders have been successful in keeping infection rates at lower levels than those of their male counterparts, and their countries, those of female leaders, are on the path to recovery. There are countless transformative effects that we see when women participate in society on an equal footing, and the list of these is growing ever longer. There needs to be more investment in social protection. We need to have a more transparent form of governance. We need to have more sustainable peace processes. Leadership and the equal representation of women is the key to the change that we need. We need to discard old structures, mould them, and cast aside old models. While the formal economy does work, it's only because it's subsidized by the unpaid labor of women. Investments in the care economy could stimulate growth, economic growth, and stimulate post-pandemic recovery. It is time to take more ambitious and targeted measures and to lay waste once and for all to the attitudes that deprive women of their rights. We need to stop simply tinkering with gender equality and achieve it properly once and for all. We must make that a reality together.
To heal geopolitical rifts and find common ground. To address today's roiling peace and security threats, we need to find a bridge back to common sense. We need a united Security Council, and we need to avoid the great fracture that would divide the world into two, working instead to ensure one world economy, one secure and open internet, cybersecurity, respect for international law, and for rules agreed by all and adhered to by all. Any dysfunction in the relations among major powers creates space for spoilers, and spoilers trigger and prolong conflicts. We can't solve our biggest problems when our biggest powers are at odds. In the early weeks of the pandemic, I called for a global ceasefire to focus on the enemy that all countries are facing. We have seen some encouraging signs and new life breathed into faltering peace processes. Ceasefires and pauses in hostilities are more or less holding in a number of places, from Libya to the Ukraine, from Syria to Sudan, from Nagorno-Karabakh to South Sudan. But elsewhere, fighting continues and new conflicts have erupted. In Yemen, which is on the brink of famine, I reiterate my call for a nationwide ceasefire, economic and humanitarian confidence-building measures, and the resumption of an inclusive political process. In the Central African Republic, I condemned the increased violence by armed groups and called on the newly elected authorities to pursue peaceful and inclusive dialogue and national reconciliation. In Mali, attacks by extremist groups, human rights violations, and violence across community lines continue in the context of challenging efforts towards the restoration of constitutional order and implementation of the peace agreement. In Afghanistan, violence is going unabated, even if peace negotiations hold out the possibility of an end to decades of conflict. There is no military solution to any of these situations. I call on all member states to pressure all relevant parties to end these senseless wars. United Nations mediators and political missions continue to explore every opening. 2021 must also be the year in which we restart the peace process in the Middle East and create conditions for the two-state solution. In the Sahel, Lake Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mozambique, we see terrorism rises in the absence of effective security arrangements and insufficient capacity to address economic, climatic, and social root causes. It's time to recognize the need for African peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations to receive a mandate by the Security Council under Chapter 7 and sufficient and predictable funding, including assessed contributions. Our peacekeeping operations are totally committed to the protection of civilians in volatile situations and are providing vital support to peace processes. But they operate more and more in areas where there is no peace to keep. Already this year, 9 peacekeepers have been killed in hostile incidents. We must ensure that every peacekeeping mission and every peacekeeper possesses the full resources and equipment necessary to fulfill their duties. We will continue to implement reforms, namely the action for peacekeeping. We need a global ceasefire, but we also must intensify our efforts to prevent crises from erupting in the first place. Unity and peace are possible. We must make it happen together. Mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, an 8th priority is to get the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime back on its feet. It has truly been eroded. On Friday, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force. I call upon all states to support the aim of this treaty. Despite this development, we should all be alarmed by the deteriorating relations between nuclear weapons states. I call upon those states to find common ground during the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which will take place this year. I am pleased that the United States and the Russian Federation have decided to extend the New START Treaty for a 5-year period, the maximum provided for, thus allowing time for the negotiation of new reductions. A world without nuclear weapons is possible. We must make it a reality together. Ladies and gentlemen, a 9th priority is to benefit from the opportunities provided by digital technologies, whilst also guarding against the increasing dangers they represent. During the pandemic, digital technologies allowed societies to function and allowed humanity to remain connected. But the pandemic has also highlighted the immense gap in access to these tools and the existence of vast disparities between men and women. The digital divide has still not been reduced. Our objective is for everyone, everywhere, to have affordable, stable and secure access to the internet by 2030, and for all schools to be connected as quickly as possible. We must strengthen cybersecurity and promote the adoption of responsible behaviour in this area. And we must establish a ceasefire in cyberspace to put an end to cyber attacks targeting important infrastructure. We must attack the problem of the spread of hate, exploitation and disinformation online. And we must resolve the issue of the use of our data. A large part of the data that is gathered is, it's true, used for positive purposes, but there is a growing demand for us all to have our say on the way in which these data are used, notably when they are used to influence and control our behaviour. The way in which governments can also exploit data to violate the human rights of discriminated persons and groups is also increasingly worrying. We must bring all stakeholders together to consider these practices and these usage models and agree on a path that does not impinge upon people's private lives or their dignity. In this respect, we need to continue the efforts that have been undertaken already with all actors to establish international norms and appropriate tax regimes. The rapid rise of artificial intelligence makes this question of the management of data ever more pressing. Artificial intelligence brings with it vast promises, but biased data can lead to dangerous biases in the use of that data, and human beings must remain in control of the situation. I continue to call for a ban on lethal autonomous weapons systems. Last year, I launched an action plan on digital cooperation, and in the coming year, I will continue to do everything to ensure that it is applied and implemented, including by strengthening the Internet Governance Forum. I welcome the intention of the President of the General Assembly to organise a debate on digital cooperation in April. An open, free and safe digital future is possible. We must make it a reality together.
Excellencies, a 10th priority must be a reset for the 21st century. Our governance of global commons, not just public health, but also peace and the natural environment, needs to be reinforced and reimagined. The General Assembly has recognized the pivotal nature of this moment. In your declaration marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, you called on me to make recommendations to advance our common agenda. I am well embarked on a process of profound reflection, building on last year's UN 75 global consultations. The challenges ahead clearly demand a more inclusive and more network multilateralism. I have also called for a new global deal among countries to ensure that power, benefits and opportunities are shared more broadly and fairly. Developing countries merit a larger voice in global decision-making. And young people must also be at the table as designers of their own future, not as recipients of decisions of elders who have, let's be honest, failed them in so many key aspects. My report in September should be seen as the beginning of this reset. Strengthening global governance to deliver global public goods is possible. We must make it happen together. Excellencies, with your support, we have taken important steps to strengthen our United Nations. The pandemic has been the first major test of these reforms, and I'm grateful for your feedback indicating that these chances have improved our work. I'm totally committed to continue these efforts. Opportunity has been granted to us in the most unfortunate of ways. But crisis gives rise to change. We can move from an annus horribilis to make this an annus possibilitatis, a year of possibility and hope. It is possible to build the world we want. We must make it happen together, and I thank you.